spiritual direction and then move to history. So today she's going to see if she can implicit. So I wasn't really sure.
But I was like, it's alright. It's alright. Yeah, I was like, yeah. Good morning. I'm mostly trying to plan for you guys to meet my friends.
This is my very good one, but it's basically
Yeah.
hopefully homeschool, they homeschool. This is today's classroom, and this is like
But this, oh my god, this is
so cute.
wow. My grandma.
Wait, did she comment on the? I was like, is this Yuri's grandma? I did. I was like, this has gotta be Yuri's grandma.
I was like, this is a memory. I don't know, like you said, perfect. Yeah. She does not read. It is cracking up. And she commented a few months ago on one of my moms. I can't remember what she said. It was so funny. And my mom was like, I'm not even going to respond to her.
Is it your dad or your mom?
My mom. Yeah. It was so funny. And sometimes you have random Facebook stuff all the time about, and like something I would no idea. Like, what are you talking about? Hold on. Let me see if I can find
I'm not push it over.
As long as my mom posts the camera.
Alright, so now just about time, before we get into new material, just again, I'm now finished with all midterms of this class. So if you haven't looked at grade and no comments, you can feel free to do so. Not right now, but when you have opportunity outside of class, please.
Where do you find the comments on Blackboard? Because I tried to look in the grade section, like for the specific class, and I can't see any of the comments.
Because I've never seen it from a student point of view, I feel stupid in saying this, but I really honestly do not know the answer to that question. Does anyone in the class know how to do this? There is a way to get into this. I mean, as soon as I submit it, it's possible for you to get You just have to click on the right secret button in Blackboard. I can try to find the answer. I just don't know. I don't think.
Okay.
But it is possible to see these comments because other people have seen them. So
Okay.
other bases comment on. If you have individual questions, feel free to come email me or see me privately. I have no general comments because there's some exams that were really excellent, and other people I don't think necessarily have to do the reading and or. I think the structure of the semester has it perhaps caused some you not do as well as you might do otherwise. That can change. I hope it does change those who didn't do as well as you might have, but put the time in now. All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to begin, certainly not end, our discussion of ancient Rome, and you'll see that in particular today we're going to start talking about the first major government that Rome would have in the ancient world. That is a republic. And by the end of this day, of course, we're going to end up with a Rome looking like this, that becomes the major power of the Mediterranean. It starts off at a much more modest area, where really Rome starts out being a city, and then in time it's going to end up being this vast sort of government. In many cases, with civilizations we've talked about in this class, it is very hard for us now to appreciate how important they are. But in fact, this case has never been true of Rome. Unlike many of these other civilizations that have really been very badly studied sometimes in the past, Rome has always been a subject of interest for people, for Western scholarship. And I would suggest part of that is just the deep influence of Rome. Part of that, though, goes to the fact that Rome has wonderful monuments that you can still see and access today, which really kept it very much on people's minds. And here I'm just showing you one of the most famous monumental archaeological sites in the entire ancient world. This is known as the Roman Forum, which, although hard to imagine now, was once the center of the political and really in some ways social world of the ancient period. Let me show you this. So the 19th century, you can see a lot of what we know today in this Roman Forum was still underground and had been dug up again. You can see a lot of these monuments were overgrown. So the love of Rome and the love of learning more about it grows with time as well too. Where does Rome start? Well, the first thing I can tell you is not so much a modern historical theory, but where Romans themselves thought that they started. The story that Romans told was that there were two baby twin brothers known as Romulus and Remus, who were cast out or exposed to the elements at an early age. But instead of dying, there was a friendly she-wolf who came along, and rather than what you might anticipate that a she-wolf would do, which is eat them, this she-wolf was nice enough to take them in and supposedly actually suckle them as well with the milk. Most people, of course, and here's a coin with that legend on it as well from Rome. The vast majority of people these days take this to be an unserious legend, and even Romans themselves did not necessarily think much of it. But this is, of course, from the one of these two twin boys. Romulus is the mythological founder of the city of Rome. Supposedly, when he grows up after this wolf experience, he will be the one to start building the city of Rome. But as many with Roman stories, this has a dark turn to it because initially Romulus's city wall was so weak and puny that his brother Remus made fun of it. He actually just hurdled it to show how pathetic it was. And Romulus got annoyed and then killed his own brother. Not exactly the happiest foundation story of all time, but it works. If there is anything that historians can actually pick apart from this myth that describes the origin of Rome, the one element that actually might be interesting here is the wolf, believe it or not. The reason for this is that we do actually know that there was religious reverence in Italy for the wolf, and especially for the most important people in Italy who were really dominant before Romans come to the fore. This people were known as the Etruscans. The Etruscans, before Rome comes on the scene, this was the dominant people in Italy. Especially, they hold on to a series of cities in the central part of Italy. The Etruscans, in many ways, for modern-day historians, are a very mysterious people. We have a very good archaeology from them. We have a lot of their physical remains, essentially from getting them from their graves. But we don't know a lot of things. And even some of the graves we have, it's very frustrating that they were plundered, in some cases in the modern world, to sell their artifacts. So we don't actually have a very good record of what the Etruscans had. Sometimes the things we get from Etruscan sites too are also extremely frustrating. I show you here, this is one inscription from the Etruscans. If you look very closely, you'll see, wait a minute, I know those letters. Maybe I can read Etruscan. The answer is no, you can't, and in fact, no one can. Etruscan is a language that we actually can't read. There's actually a lot of debate, in fact, exactly what linguistic family it belongs to. In effect, we have very few examples, too, of the Etruscan writing because Romans systematically later on will destroy Etruscan writing. So it actually makes it much more difficult for us to try to puzzle out what their writing was. So what do we know about these Etruscans? The first thing I have to say is that the old way of thinking about the Etruscans was that they were so advanced in the Italy of their time that they could not have come from Italy. And many people look at some of their physical structures, like their use of metals, for instance, and some of the weapons, the metal weapons at their disposal, and they compare them with ones that we knew from the ancient Near East and said, well, they probably were immigrants who came to this area. And then for a long time, that used to be the dominant theory. As time went on, though, there really failed to be any serious link tying the Etruscans with the ancient Near East. And in fact, most people think that the more obvious theory is these people are native Italians who just spoke a different language than the Romans did. They were the politically dominant force for a long time. To give you some idea of why the Etruscans remain so mysterious, this is just one of many artifacts that we have from them. A lot of them are funerary monuments, and you can see here this is an Etruscan couple, and they're kind of lying on this bed together. They actually were buried underneath here. These kinds of finds sometimes led the historians to say stupid things like Etruscans love just proclaiming and sort of hanging out, which is a little bit silly in a way because the way people are depicted in death is not necessarily the way they live their lives. So it's a little bit of a leap to say that this is an average life. Occasionally you'll get things like this from Etruscan finds to give us some idea of what their houses might have looked like. Very simple houses. But there's a lot of frustration that comes with not having a lot of writing, as you could tell. In any case, no one denies that the Etruscans had iron, they had very good weapons, and they come into the fore in central Italy and had a very strong sort of power base there. We don't think that there ever was one empire of the Etruscans. What you begin to see in many important cities throughout Italy is that you get Etruscan kings. And there were vague alliances among different cities, but they were all independent of one another. And here, just to give you some idea, these are some of the main cities that the Etruscans had. For our purposes, of course, the ones that we care most about is this city here. Rome was just one of many of these areas that was dominated by Etruscans and their kings. Before before the Romans really come to the fore. And among other things too, we do think that the Etruscans, especially noticing this position, a lot of their cities close to the sea, this was a good area for trading. In fact, some of your old friends, the Greeks, actually would come to Etruscan cities to trade for goods on a fairly regular basis. The reason why Rome itself becomes very important in the sort of constellation of different Etruscan cities is it is located directly on the Tiber River. A river that in the very ancient sort of period, the Tiber River was good for agriculture. They actually do agriculture in the city of Rome. Later, it actually serves to help to get, for instance, merchants into the city. So it helps with trading to create Rome as a major trading power. For reasons that we do not entirely understand in the modern world, at some point, the people, the Latin speakers, the ancestors of the Romans, decide that they are going to break away from the Etruscan masters. They're going to revolt against the Etruscan kings and kick them out of town, basically. No one is entirely sure why this happens, except that we do have a Roman source that talks about the reason that Romans supposedly revolt. This story goes that essentially one of the last Etruscan kings was such a tyrant that at one point he did an unspeakably evil act. He ends up raping a virtuous Roman woman. And in effect, this action is so horrible that eventually the Romans choose to revolt against the Etruscan kings. This story, again, some people have wondered whether or not this is historical in nature. It may just have been sort of something that was the straw that broke the camel's back. But in any case, it is obvious that Romans do end up becoming very discontented with Etruscan kings, and eventually decide they can't live underneath them anymore. They drive them out of the city, and they begin to then install Romans basically as their leaders in the city of Rome. Even though Etruscans leave the city, we do think that the Romans are smart enough to continue some of their more positive features, including, for instance, some of the very interesting legacies that, for instance, that connection with Greek civilization continues in early Rome. They continue to receive Greek traders. We also think that certain other things that Romans do, like gladiatorial games that we'll talk more about later, blood sport. This was an Etruscan custom that the Romans just overtake. Other things like, for instance, having long sort of processions in the city that go around the city. This was something that the Etruscans loved, and the Romans do as well. Perhaps even more interesting is that the Romans overtake the Etruscan method of trying to tell the future. The Romans too cared a lot about oracles from the gods. And the way that Etruscan priests, later Roman priests, would do this was that you would sacrifice an animal to the gods before you did important events like going to war. And then you would cut your animal open, and you would take out its liver, and you would read the liver to try to see whether or not the sacrifice had been accepted by the gods, and thus whatever you were going to do was going to be successful. How did you know how to read a liver? Well, you could just be really good at it, or you could have a cheat sheet. And in fact, what this is a metal cheat sheet. That is, believe it or not, this is meant to show an animal's liver and what you're supposed to be able to read from various parts of the liver. This is something that these priests used. All right, this is the goddess Rome. Where are we now? Romans have just kicked out their old kings. And this is the period in which the Romans decide to devise an entirely new system of government. And one really by the end of this lecture is going to be gone, but it's going to end up lasting for around 450 years. And as far as the Romans were concerned, these were the good old days. this is when we had the best government, these were men were strong, all these sort of good things. So they themselves are going to think that this was the greatest time, really, for Rome. No one wanted one-man rule again. That was the one thing that was obvious to everyone, that they got rid of the king and didn't use them again. In fact, that was the only form of government that Romans detested, monarchy. What they end up doing, though, is rather than having a one-man rule again, they begin to adopt a system of government that sort of actually looks similar in some aspects to some of the Greek policies that we talked about. But if anything, it was just a slightly more complex form of government that really allowed a lot of participation by adult-free men. The system of government under this republic was divided into three major features that are going to make it up. The first of these were, just like in the Greek world, citizen assemblies. If you were a man, if you were free, you could go in person to Rome, you could debate issues of state, you could pass laws, you could elect politicians meant to represent you. This was not a perfect system by far. In part, I told you, it excludes a lot of people. Second of all, it is fair to say the voice of the rich dominated. Because the way that they would vote was in order of how much property you had. So by the time they got to most issues, they were not people who were really small landholders were not voting at all, because their vote wouldn't have counted. I mean, by that point, they were decided. Another weird quirk about this form of government is that there's no absentee voting. You have to actually be in Rome to cast your vote. The second big sort of feature of the republic were the politicians that were elected. And of course, this is something that we're familiar with, this idea that the people will then elect all different kind of politicians who have very specific jobs to do. The top of the ladder of this system was a position known as a consul. Consuls were always elected 2 at a time on purpose, so you don't get one person dominating the government. Consuls are basically like co-presidents in their system. These are people who have immense experience. They come from usually the best families, and they're people who end up taking really the reins of power. Both, for us very strangely, both on a civil level in terms of running the government, but also on a military level. A consul can also lead an army. He's a general as well, and both of that is part of the same position. If the consul is at the top, though, there's many other lesser positions. Rome voted for judges, for instance. That was a position that you could vote for. You could also you could elect the person who conducts a census. Any guess of what this person is called? Who conducts the census?
Census taker.
Well, that was a cheating way, really, out of the argument.
The censor?
Censor, yeah. It doesn't have our meaning of the word censor, right? In fact, this was a positive thing in Rome. The weirdest position, the weirdest politician in Rome, and one that really was used very sparingly, not elected every year, like most positions, was the dictator. If the state was in absolute crisis, Romans could elect a one-person ruler for a limited period of time, I think no more than 6 months, to basically help clean up the crisis, and then that's it. The person would have to relinquish those special powers. And this was really used very sparingly because guess what? Dictators look a lot like kings, and that made everyone uncomfortable. The third and final feature of the Republic, and this is one especially for Americans that often trips people up, is something known as the Senate. This is the Senate building as it looks now. The weird part, in the US, of course, the Senate can pass laws, I mean, at least on a theoretical level. The weird part about the Senate in the Roman Republic was that it does not actually have the power to actually pass laws. So it's a very different kind of body. What the Senate in Rome was that people who had previously been politicians and retired would go into this body. And it really is like an advisory board for the state. The Senate can tell politicians, this is what you ought to do. It can tell citizen assemblies, this is how you ought to vote. And based upon all of their experience. And in fact, the term senator in Latin actually comes from a word meaning old man. They're all old men. And they're meant to then help direct the state, but without the power to force anybody out. So the weird part is, as a politician, you can actually ignore the Senate. But if you do ignore the Senate, you damn well better be right, because that's the end of your political career. You choose to go against their advice, and you prove that the Senate is actually right all along. Yeah. The vast majority of people in this, as all the ancient societies we talk about, were peasants. Sometimes we forget in Rome that this society is overwhelmingly rural and agricultural. Most people live on farms. In fact, one of the basic Latin terms for money comes from a flock of sheep or cattle. So in effect, that is what money is for many people. What's very interesting about the Roman system I've just described to you, though, is that initially when they formed this system, the peasants had very little voice. In fact, many peasants begin to revolt against the power of the state. And Rome was, to its credit, recognized at some point that they had to give the peasants more of a voice. And so they created a special politician to respond to the interests of the poor. And this was a person referred to as a tribune. The tribune, he's a politician whose main job it was basically to watch out for the poor and to pursue their interests. And to be able to do this, they decided to give the tribune special powers. So for instance, he was what was known as sacrosanct. And what this meant, quite literally, was that you could not put your hands on the tribune, and no one else other than him, of course. If you put your hands on the tribune, you would be liable for the death penalty. You could be killed on the spot. Which is clever because it meant that it's very hard to attack tribunes if you don't like what they're doing, because you could be killed yourself very easily. The other thing that the tribune can do, and this is kind of a cool power as well, let's say a law was being passed that the tribune felt would disproportionately harm the interests of the poor. He could yell out, veto, a term that in Latin means I forbid, and essentially nullify the law. That's where we get the term veto from. All right. As I told you earlier, this system, this political system, most people tend to think was fairly complicated altogether, but it was a system that, at its best, ran fairly well, and it did, to some degree, permit a gradual change in the system. We wouldn't be sitting around talking about Rome were just for the fact that it had a really kind of interesting government. And the reason why Rome becomes so relevant in a world civilization class was that even from its very foundation, Rome viewed itself as an expansionist power. And really, even from when the initial foundation of Rome as an independent city, in comparison with other ancient places, Rome had one of the highest percentages of men forced to join the army, perhaps outside of Sparta. There's no place that had a greater percentage of young men who were forcibly conscripted. Then basically every male citizen could potentially be a warrior for Rome, which meant, by the way, that many of the earliest battles Rome fought were not fought by professionals. They were fought by peasant farmer soldiers, people whose main job it was not to fight. And I hate to say this, but in effect, the results were telling. Rome very often wins a lot of its early battles, not because of its genius strategy. It is because they can throw more live people on the battlefield against than any of their enemies can. They win just by sheer numbers. But the amount of casualties that early Romans will take is just enormous. But this was very much part of their culture. This was something that was really prized. So the casualties didn't really bother people as much as you might think. I'm just a Roman soldier. We could talk all day about Roman expansion. It is fair to say some of the earliest Roman expansion occurs first in Italy itself, this sort of green part. And without going blow by blow, part of Rome's genius, in essence, was in many cases not to just directly conquer places, but to form alliances with some of the other Italian cities. Alliances that in some cases would force those cities to produce a certain number of men for the Roman army, which meant then that they too would be involved in the next conquest of Rome. So they constantly snowballed to the point where they got more and more men. The conquest of Italy, and eventually involving the southern Greek parts, ran fairly smoothly. The first time Rome really has to deal with a major foreign international power comes in what is known as the Punic Wars, which were 3 wars that were fought against this major North African power. With its base in what today is modern-day Tunisia. They're referred to as Punic Wars because this is the term, Punic was the term that Romans used to describe the people of this other empire, which the empire is Carthage. The first 2 battles, here's just one of the naval bases of Carthage. The first battle against Carthage was largely a naval affair. And in fact, Rome dominates nearly every single battle, which is strange because they didn't have much of a naval tradition previously. And the second battle, though, with Carthage was really, in many cases, most people would say is the most decisive of the battles. This is the war where the most interesting part of this war really was when the major general for Carthage, you don't have to know for this class if this is Hannibal, will end up actually landing in Spain, where Carthage had some territories, and then taking a group of elephants over the Alps in northern Italy to descend upon Rome's holdings. Something that people still don't know entirely how he did. Again, those who still think that battle elephants sound pretty lame, can you imagine the first time you meet an elephant when it's charging on you in the battlefield? It would be pretty terrifying, I think, altogether. We think that Hannibal had been trained by a Spartan, believe it or not, and he was in fact very good at just destroying Roman armies. But although he could win battles, he could never win the war. And none of the cities in Italy would really ally with him. They thought he was basically a barbarian. And eventually what Rome decides to do, Rome sends one of its greatest generals, attacks them at their other holdings, the holdings of Carthage, first in Spain and then in North Africa, and forces Carthage to withdraw its soldiers from Italy and to meet Rome on the battlefield at home. And Rome wins that battle handily. The last war against Carthage was not really much of a war so much as genocide. Rome decides eventually in time that it's really tired of having, Carthage actually bounces back from the Second War and is doing pretty well for itself, which annoys the hell out of Romans to the point where they decided that Carthage has to be destroyed from the face of the earth. And so that's what they do. They send soldiers who just completely wipe out Carthage, kill off people, sell people into slavery. That is very Roman as well. This map here gives you some idea. I mean, what's important, the reason I spent so much time with these Punic Wars is that once Carthage is out of the picture, all of a sudden, the Mediterranean can become a Roman lake, a Roman sea. And now they can begin one by one to pick off some of the great powers of the ancient world, the Mediterranean. Like, for instance, your old friend in the Greek world. Rome, eventually, Macedon begins acting up again and attacking other Greeks. Rome decides that they don't want anyone else dominating this region except for them. They come in, they beat Macedon several times over. Initially, they were going to allow the Greeks to be independent. Finally, it became too much trouble. They decided they're just going to take over the entire Greek world. And this same process, really, in some ways, repeats itself in other places until you can see areas of southern France, Spain, which had previously been in part holding of Carthage. They slaughter a bunch of natives and take Spain. They take areas of the Middle East one by one. And as I mentioned, this attitude that Romans have, listen, you used to be our foes, but now come on board, come join us. The next time we slaughter a bunch of helpless natives and steal all their things, you can be with us. You can be the victor and you can have all these goods. And this is a very, very important pitch. This is how Romans constantly, the snowballing effect that conquest has. We think that as this happens, as Rome conquers more and more, all of a sudden we think that Rome has to very quickly change itself from being a power that was just located in Italy to now this dominant colonial power. And now it begins to appoint Romans as governors to go out and to live in these various regions. Never very many. The number of governors in Rome was teeny in comparison with the governance they did. And in part, they could afford having so few people because the attitude of governors was basically, go out there, all you have to do as a governor is two things. First of all, keep the peace. We don't want these people to revolt. Second of all, make sure taxes continue to flow to Rome. If they did those two things, governors had done their job. And in the process, many of these governors become notoriously corrupt and fleece the natives continuously because they felt that that was one of the perks of the job, more or less. Not all governors were corrupt, but many were. We also see in time that most of the areas that Rome ends up taking, they feel they're a bunch of barbarians beneath them culturally. But that is not true of the Greek world, where, of course, Greeks had a very high culture, as we've talked about in this class. And in fact, Romans recognize this too. In many ways, rather than developing their own culture, in many ways they start taking things from Greek culture wholesale. So, for instance, Greeks were known to build enormous baths in which people would bathe. And Romans like this idea when they see this in Greece, and they start to import it. And now in Rome, they begin to build these huge baths that people can go in together. We know, too, that Romans love Greek theater. And in fact, they actually, for the first time, begin to build huge theaters to put on, in some cases, Greek plays that have just been translated into Latin. And in other times, they borrow some of the Greek plots and they turn them into new Latin plays that people can see instead. We also, this is just a Greek play. We also see, too, that in effect, Romans love Greek art. And they love it so well that in many cases they just take it. They take it back to Rome with them. So in many cases, some of our finest examples of art from the Greek world is not anymore in Greece. They're actually were taken from Rome. Please.
So is there anything that the Romans didn't take from the Greeks?
It's not to say that they do have some sort of biases against Greeks sometimes, some of the Greek ways. So it's not 100% borrowing.
Yeah. But did they have things that were just Roman culture, or it seems like?
Oh no, I mean I'm being a little facetious here, but there was a culture before, but it certainly was nowhere near as developed as when they met Greeks. In addition to just taking Greek stuff, even better than that was taking Greeks. And Romans decide now that what you can do now is turn Greeks, people who previously had been very well educated, you could force them to become tutors to your children. That's the best way to learn the Greek language, learn it from a Greek. And so, in fact, many cases, you shouldn't, in the Roman world, slaves were not synonymous with people who, and other slave cultures, they forced slaves to be unable to read and write. Romans did not think that way. Why wouldn't you want to have a slave who was literate? You could teach your children. So they actually liked that idea. Many people would say that, and this is even truer under the next time we'll talk about Rome, that no matter what you thought about Romans' treatments of natives, we do think that Romans do establish a kind of peace throughout the Mediterranean. They really, Romans generally do not force people to follow their culture. So long as you basically kept quiet and paid your taxes, you could keep whatever culture you wanted to help. So there is a tolerance built into the system, as long as you didn't challenge them politically or militarily, in which case they would squash you. At this point, you may be wondering, this sounds good, what could possibly go wrong with this system? And in time, what we're going to see is this constant sort of a period of conquest and taking all sorts of goods is actually going to expose some of the basic weaknesses of the Roman system of government, the Republic that it was founded. In part, this is because Romans, now they were fighting so many wars on so many fronts that in some cases, Romans will simply ignore their own rules for elections for politicians, like the consul. They'll say, listen, we need a general stat to take this war over. Who can we find? And they just don't even elect some people who were supposed to be elected generals. They just send them out when they're needed. We also think there's a real danger, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, in sending out these generals who become larger than life figures because they have, in some cases, gained enormous territories by their conquest, lots of money, and their soldiers see them as their primary benefactors. They don't see themselves as being loyal to Rome so much as their individual general. So it's dangerous. One of the strangest parts, though, about this whole process of Rome enriching itself by conquest is that one of the people who do not benefit are the people who have done a lot of the fighting, and that is to say, the peasant soldiers, the farmers, who were, in some cases, again, they were forcibly brought into the army, and they had to live in international areas for years, but they didn't end up actually seeing a lot of the proceeds of these wars. So, in effect, in some cases, these farmers were gone for so long that their own farms at home become very weak and undefended. And rich Romans sometimes will take advantage of the situation to essentially either buy up land at very low cost to themselves, or in some cases, just basically steal it. And the rich begin to create what are referred to, there's no real English term for this, so I give you the Latin term, latifundia. These are super estates. These are enormous farms that included what previously would have been independent peasant farms. I'm showing you here, by the way, you may say this looks like a field. Indeed, it is. But if you look very closely, what you see here is the ghostly outline of what some of the buildings for a Roman farm. Although the buildings themselves are no longer there, if you put a building over grass for long enough, the new grass that grows will never grow as high. The roots will not be as deep. And so when you get a really dry summer, occasionally in places in Europe, you'll actually see this phenomenon happen, where all of a sudden you see the outlines of where Roman buildings used to be. So this is actually one of those examples. And so it would fly over planes, you can actually take pictures of these and get some sense of where they were. Now, The question you might have, of course, is how was it now that these rich Romans could do without having peasants to farm their land? And the answer is, again, war had provided the answer. The dark way, but it had provided the answer. Which is to say, there is this huge number of captives from war that flow into Rome and are forced to become slaves. And they use this labor, rich begin to buy slaves, and force them to work on their land. So in essence, that is the other result of the war. Now you have this huge slave population flowing to Italy and other parts of the empire. And they're the ones now who do a lot of the farming instead. Now, as a small landholder, there were only so many options available to you in this situation. One of them is you could actually now, because you're still a citizen, you can join the army. And this is the first time we begin to see the army becomes more of a life sort of commitment. People become professionals now, because now these peasants have no other choice. The other possibility, if you did want to join the army, is some of these Roman citizens will go now to the city of Rome. They still have a vote, they're still citizens, and they still can help, they think, to elect people who will remedy their situation. And so that's what many people end up doing. We think that in many cases, what this means is that politics in Rome becomes worse and worse as time goes on, because now you have this large group of unemployed people in the city of Rome who in some cases are itching for a fight. They're really, you need to see sort of street fighting in Rome over some of these issues. About what are you going to do with the poor man? Some politicians are going to very cleverly attempt to gain the vote of the poor and say, for instance, we will make sure to give out new land to the poor, some of these new territories we've conquered. Well, they thought of other remedies to deal with these difficulties, but the problem always comes with the same class. The rich do not want to give up territory, and they don't really care as much about the plight of the poor. And so, in fact, some of the politicians who stuck their necks out to try to remedy the situation end up getting assassinated publicly. This becomes a fatal position for some people, these reformers. What will really, though, bring a complete halt to the Republic is a series of military crises, strikes in different areas of Rome at the same time. Some of them in Africa, some of them in modern-day France. The danger here is that, in fact, some of the people sent out to deal with these problems, some of the generals, end up winning brilliant victories, but a lot of the money and the glory ends up flowing to the generals themselves. And they become such larger-than-life figures that they don't have to listen to the politicians back at Rome anymore. They become warlords, and they can basically do what they choose. And that's very dangerous when you have a system that's meant to be a republic. I don't have time to talk about all of these warlords, but I will talk about the one, probably the only one that you've heard of. This is Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar's career began in a completely legitimate fashion. He came from a good family. He ended up being elected different political positions. Eventually, he'll become consul. And where he really gets his name is he will, as consul, he'll go out to modern-day France, and he campaigns there for several years, and he wins this brilliant series of victories over the natives, which we know a lot about because he never tired talking about how wonderful he was and how brilliant his conquests were. And in fact, if there's one person responsible for making France a Roman place, it's really Julius Caesar. The good part about it for him was that Julius Caesar was also away from the dirty street fighting in Rome, so his hands were clean, and he was a military hero in people's eyes. Julius Caesar, like many of these warlords, had a group of soldiers who 100% loyal to him, do whatever he asked. In addition, he had the right personality to do all sorts of interesting things. He was cool, he was patient, and when the situation calls for it, he was ruthless. One very interesting story, for instance, is earlier in his life, before he ends up becoming a general, he was at one point when he was young kidnapped by a group of pirates. He says to all the pirates while he's on the ship waiting for his family to ransom him all, he says, you know guys, I'm going to have all of you crucified right in front of me. And sure enough, when he got back to Rome, he made sure that they all got the death penalty and he watched them as they died, which apparently is a lot of fun in Rome. In any case, we think that most of the politicians who lived in Rome, the populace generally, really were very afraid of Julius Caesar and what he was going to do once his conquest in France was over. They began to manufacture all sorts of charges against him, saying he took money from the natives while he was conquering these places, which was funny because that's what every single general did. So it was a little bit of a strange thing to charge him with. In any case, though, we think that Caesar eventually will lose patience with politicians back at home. And he doesn't want to be on trial when he comes back. He wants to come back as a hero and a victor. And so what he decides to do then is take his entire army and march on the city of Rome, which I probably don't need to tell you, was not allowed. He, in fact, was now invading his own country. Julius Caesar manages then to beat in battle some of these other warlords who were sent out to try to stop him handily. And when he enters the city of Rome, as he was very smart in that he, in some ways, he knew when to forgive. And any politician who previously had been against him, who was willing to come down and humiliate himself in front of Caesar, he would actually just allow them to be friends now. He wouldn't take his revenge. So he pardoned a lot of people. The problem was, of course, what to do with Caesar once he gets back to Rome. Well, what position does he hold now? And the politicians in Rome end up creating this totally unprecedented situation to try to figure out what Caesar was. They begin to refer to him now as a dictator for life. So the position of dictator had already existed, but it had always been a fixed-term deal. Now, Julius Caesar was going to be someone with absolute power, but never had to give it up, which, of course, in our terms, looks a lot like a king. Romans were sensitive to that fact. Now, please don't get me wrong. There are good things about monarchy, which is to say you don't have to worry about debate to get reforms passed. And one of the most consequential reforms that Julius Caesar passed is the calendar, sometimes referred to as the Julian calendar. And I'm not going to tell you how this works, because all of you know how the Julian calendar works. It's the calendar, in essence, that we still use today. That 365 days in your year, every fourth year you have a leap year. This is when it was instituted in Rome, and eventually all the West. That was the good part. The bad part, of course, was that now everyone knew that in the Republic, Julius Caesar had complete control over the political system. He could really handpick any politicians. He could do whatever he wanted, which some people at the time rightly pointed out, this goes against our entire system of government now to have someone who, in all but name, is a king. Some of the conservatives in Rome then, as many of you will know, begin to create a conspiracy to assassinate Julius Caesar. In fact, one day when he goes into the Senate, he is actually, he's killed by a group of these conspirators. Upon reading, however, Julius Caesar's will and discovering that Julius Caesar, even at the end, wanted to make a sort of a big show, he decided that he would give a lot of his money to the Romans, to all sorts of Romans, which really in some ways inspired this loathing that many people had against the conspirators, those people who had killed Julius Caesar. In fact, far from what they had tried to do is paint themselves as people who had liberated Rome, now people were beginning to look at conspirators and say that they should never have done what they did in killing Julius Caesar. In fact, most conspirators had to flee the city very quickly. Within 2 years, all the conspirators had themselves been killed as a result of their actions. And as for Julius Caesar, well, he ends up becoming a god. I'm not saying in a theological sense, but in his own time, some people, upon his death, saw that there was a comet that ran around the time of his assassination. People took that to mean, that was Julius Caesar's soul, really ascending to divinity. What comes after, of course, the Republic is what we will do next time. I'll do that. Thank you. Bye-bye.